He thought a waitress was beneath him and ordered her away, certain his wealth made him untouchable. But when she spoke his late father's name, the entire restaurant froze. The night air outside was cool and heavy with the smell of the city, yet Alexander Whitmore barely noticed as he stepped from the sleek black car that had carried him through the streets. He moved with the steady confidence of a man who had long ago grown used to every eye turning in his direction. His midnight suit was tailored to perfection, the dark fabric catching the glow of the street lamps, and the polished shoes on his feet seemed to strike the pavement with the authority of his fortune. $9.7 billion had built walls around him, and those walls followed him wherever he went, even now as he crossed the marble threshold of the restaurant that bore his family's name. The Gilded Lion was the crown jewel of his empire, a place where senators and financiers and foreign dignitaries competed for reservations months in advance. And tonight, Alexander had chosen to enter without warning, knowing the shock of his presence would be enough to make even the most confident manager stumble. The chandeliers blazed with golden light that dripped like liquid fire across mirrors and crystal, and every whisper in the dining room dimmed as soon as Alexander's tall frame came into view. The hostess, a young woman in a black dress with a smile rehearsed to the point of exhaustion, nearly dropped her tablet as she recognized him. She rushed forward, her voice trembling with both excitement and fear as she welcomed him, and though he gave her no more than a small nod, she felt her breath catch, as if she had been touched by royalty. Behind her, waiters and busboys straightened in unison, their movements sharpening as though a general had entered their ranks. Alexander allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction at the reaction. He had not come here for food, not really, but for the ritual of power itself. He walked through the dining room slowly, his eyes sweeping across the velvet booths and mahogany tables, taking in every detail. He noted the arrangement of silverware, the crisp folds of linen napkins, the silent glide of wine stewards with bottles worth more than most cars. He was not looking for mistakes, but for assurance that perfection had been maintained. Perfection was his inheritance, his demand, and his expectation. To the diners who recognized him, he was the image of wealth and control, his sharp jaw set with calm determination, his cufflinks glinting like tiny suns beneath the lights. Conversations hushed, and even the clinking of glasses seemed muted. When the maitre d' hurried forward, Alexander simply raised a hand, signaling that he wanted a corner table, private but commanding, a place from which he could watch the room without being swallowed by it. The request was met instantly, and soon he was seated, his posture precise, his gaze steady. Around him the staff moved faster, the kitchen humming like a machine wound too tightly, all desperate to prove themselves in the presence of their master. Alexander Whitmore leaned back in his chair, the weight of $9.7 billion resting invisibly across his shoulders, and in that moment he wanted only three things: privacy, authority, and perfection. The maitre d' guided Alexander Whitmore with the careful precision of someone handling a priceless work of art, his hand extended as though he were leading royalty to a throne. The prime corner table was set slightly apart from the others, placed so its occupant could see the entire dining room while still enjoying a sense of privacy. It was the table reserved for heads of state, for actors whose faces appeared on magazine covers, for guests whose very presence elevated the reputation of the restaurant. Tonight it belonged to Alexander, and as he slid into the high-backed leather chair, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. Conversation slowed, glasses paused halfway to lips, and the hush that followed him from the doorway deepened into reverent silence. The polished cufflinks on his wrists caught the glow of the chandelier above, scattering fragments of light across the linen tablecloth. They were discreet yet unmistakable, small markers of power that carried the memory of his father, who had worn them in boardrooms decades earlier. Alexander knew their effect, just as he knew the way the room responded to the sharp line of his suit, the smooth precision of his tie, and the controlled elegance of his every movement. He did not need to demand attention, because it was already his. offered freely, even unwillingly, by strangers who could not look away. A sommelier appeared almost instantly, bowing with practiced grace and offering him a leather-bound wine list that weighed as much as a history book. Alexander accepted it without glancing down, his eyes instead drifting over the dining room. He saw clusters of wealthy couples leaning toward each other in intimate conversation, saw business associates huddled together with the gleam of ambition in their eyes, saw tourists marveling at their good fortune to secure a table in such a place. Each of them stole quick looks in his direction, pretending not to, yet failing to disguise their fascination. He was an exhibit in a museum of power, and he understood the part he was playing. The maitre d' returned with water poured from a crystal carafe, so fine it seemed designed for royalty. The glass in front of him sparkled beneath the chandelier's golden light, each droplet glimmering as if it carried a secret. Alexander's expression remained calm, though inside he measured the precision of every gesture, every word spoken in hushed tones by the staff. This table was not only a seat, it was a stage, and he had taken his place as both actor and critic. Across the room, a woman in pearls leaned close to whisper something to her husband, her gaze flicking toward Alexander before she quickly looked away. The man nodded with recognition, his smile tightening, his shoulders straightening, as if even from a distance he wished to impress. Such reactions had long ceased to surprise Alexander, yet tonight he felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and weariness. Attention was a currency he had never lacked, but it was also a weight that never lifted. As he rested one hand lightly against the edge of the table, he felt the entire restaurant watching, waiting for his next move. Every eye in the dining room had turned toward him, and though he sought privacy, authority, and perfection, what he found in that moment was the quiet burden of a man who could never truly be unseen. Anna moved through the dining room with the steady rhythm of someone who had repeated the same motions night after night. Yet tonight, her steps felt heavier than usual. At 22, she carried the quiet exhaustion of someone far older, though there was still a softness in her face that the long hours had not managed to erase. Her uniform was neat and pressed, the black skirt falling just right and the white blouse crisp against her skin. But her shoes told the truth. Her clothing tried to hide. The soles were worn nearly flat, the leather cracked near the toes, a reminder that she had put off buying new ones again so she could send more money home. She had learned to ignore the ache in her feet, just as she had learned to ignore the dismissive glances from wealthy diners who rarely bothered to see her as more than a moving part of the service. She adjusted the tray balanced against her hip, smoothed the front of her apron, and forced her smile to settle in place. It was not the brittle smile of someone desperate for tips, but a quiet, almost gentle expression that belonged more to who she truly was than to the role she had to play. When her eyes lifted toward the corner table, her breath caught. The man seated there was impossible to miss. He had the look of someone who belonged on magazine covers, though he was younger than many of the powerful figures she had glimpsed from a distance. His cufflinks sparkled, his suit seemed cut from midnight itself, and though he sat still, his presence filled the room like a shadow stretching across the floor. Anna felt her heartbeat quicken as she approached, not from attraction but from the instinctive awareness that this was no ordinary guest. The staff whispered about him in passing, though none ever used his name out loud in front of diners. Tonight he had appeared without warning, and already the atmosphere in the restaurant felt charged, like the air before a storm. She steadied herself, reminding her body to move with grace rather than nerves. She reached his table and placed her tray carefully on the side stand, her hands steady, though she felt the heat of his gaze settle on her. For a moment, she considered rehearsed phrases, the polished lines she was supposed to use, but something inside told her to keep it simple. She let her voice soften as she looked at him directly, not with fear, but with the quiet respect her mother had taught her to give every person, no matter their wealth or their clothing. "Good evening, sir," she said, her tone gentle but clear. "My name is Anna, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." May I start you off with something to drink? The words floated between them, carrying with them a calmness she did not entirely feel. Her smile remained, light and unforced, and though her shoes pinched her feet and her body ached from a double shift, she stood with a grace that no exhaustion could fully erase. In that instant, the grand dining room, the chandeliers, the hushed whispers all seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet question of what he would choose to reveal in return. Alexander studied the young woman standing at his table, his sharp eyes taking in her steady posture and the quiet softness in her voice. Something about her calm unsettled him. He had expected a flicker of nervousness, a stumble in her words, the usual signs that came when a server realized who they were dealing with. Instead, she seemed almost too composed, her brown eyes meeting his without a trace of fear. It irritated him in a way he did not fully understand. Power, he believed, was meant to command a reaction, yet she gave him none, only a simple offer of service, as if he were any other man. His mouth tightened, and a faint frown appeared at the corner of his lips. The silence stretched between them, and the weight of the dining room pressed closer. He leaned back in his chair, the dark fabric of his suit shifting under the light, and allowed his voice to drop into the cold, dismissive tone that had bent boardrooms to his will. "Leave my table," he said, each word clipped and precise. "Find someone else to serve me. I don't want a rookie waiting on me tonight." The sound of his voice sliced through the room like glass breaking. Nearby diners glanced up from their plates, eyes widening, ears pricking at the humiliation delivered so openly. A waiter balancing a tray paused mid-step, uncertain whether to move or freeze, and the sommelier standing near the wine rack lowered his gaze quickly to avoid being caught staring. The chandeliers still glowed, the music still played softly, but beneath it all was the sharp crack of embarrassment that now burned in the air. Anna felt the words strike her chest with a force she had not prepared for. Rookie. As though the years she had worked shifts back to back, the nights she had gone home with swollen feet and blistered hands, meant nothing at all. Her smile faltered, not completely gone but trembling at the edges. She had endured curt remarks before, had been brushed aside by guests who saw her as furniture, yet this was different. His tone carried not just irritation, but deliberate dismissal, as if her very presence at his table was an insult to him. Heat rushed to her cheeks, and for a moment she considered stepping back and obeying. It would have been easier to let someone else take the burden of this man's scrutiny, but her feet did not move. She stood with the tray still at her side, her fingers gripping the edge a little too tightly. Her heart thudded against her ribs, though her face remained calm. She heard the whispers fluttering at nearby tables, felt the sting of being put on display, yet something inside her held firm. Alexander watched her stillness with growing annoyance. He expected an apology, a hurried retreat, a replacement server rushing to his side. Instead, he was met with quiet endurance, her eyes steady though wounded, her presence unshaken despite his words. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit, though he masked the flicker of doubt behind the hard set of his jaw. The tray trembled slightly in Anna's hand, though her voice did not. She did not turn to leave as he had commanded. She did not bow her head or whisper an apology. Instead, she drew a small breath and let the words slip from her lips, soft yet sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence that hung around the table. "Your father would not have spoken to me this way, Mr. Whitmore." The sentence was not loud, but it carried. It slipped past the music and the clink of silver, reaching ears that strained for every note of tension. The room seemed to freeze, forks suspended, glasses halted halfway to mouths, conversations dissolving into stunned quiet. Alexander's eyes narrowed, the faint frown twisting into something harder, colder. Few dared to mention his father's name, fewer still in public, and never in such a pointed way. The air around him thickened, as though the walls themselves braced for the storm his voice could bring. His face hardened, the clean lines of his jaw set like stone, his gaze drilling into the young woman who stood trembling yet unyielding at his side. He leaned forward slightly, his cufflinks catching the chandelier's glow, his silence speaking louder than any raised voice could. Anna felt her pulse pounding, but she held her ground. She had not planned to say it. The words had risen from some deep place in her memory, pulled from stories her mother used to tell, about a man who had once helped when no one else would. She had spoken them without thought for consequence. Yet now the weight of her courage pressed heavy on her chest. The guests nearest to the corner table whispered in low tones, their eyes darting between the billionaire and the waitress, who had dared to remind him of a past he kept buried. Alexander finally spoke, his voice slow and edged with disbelief. "What did you just say?" The question was not for clarity but for control, a warning wrapped in calm. He was not accustomed to defiance, certainly not from a waitress in worn shoes. Still her words echoed in his mind, scraping against memories of his father that he kept locked behind polished glass. He remembered Henry Whitmore as a man of iron and fire, a builder of empires who had commanded loyalty, but also as someone who had been spoken of with affection by people far below the boardroom. To hear a stranger now use his father as a shield against his temper unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Anna's voice was steady, though her hands betrayed her, tightening on the tray. "Your father," she repeated softly, "would not have spoken to me this way." Her eyes flickered with something between sorrow and strength, and for a moment Alexander felt the dining room disappear, leaving only her words echoing in his chest. The silence that followed was deep, almost unbearable, as though the entire restaurant waited to see whether the titan of steel and glass would shatter or strike. Alexander felt the words sink into him like a blade. His father's name, spoken in that calm, quiet voice, seemed to echo far louder than anything else in the grand dining room. Henry Whitmore had been gone for over a decade, yet his shadow still stretched across the empire, Alexander commanded. Few people dared to speak of him, fewer still dared to suggest that he might have been different, better, more human. The name rattled him in a way he could not disguise. For years, he had perfected the art of masks, polished smiles for investors, hard stares for rivals, careful silence for journalists. Tonight that mask cracked, a tremor in his voice, a stiffness in his posture, the subtle shift of a man caught off guard. The room remained hushed, every diner pretending to look elsewhere, yet straining to catch each word. Alexander leaned forward, the sharp light from the chandelier gleaming across his cufflinks and the hard line of his cheekbones. His eyes locked on Anna, sharp, probing, demanding answers. "How do you know that name?" he said, his voice low but carrying. "How do you dare to speak of him to me?" Anna felt her throat tighten, but she did not step back. She had expected his anger, had braced herself for it, yet the sight of his composure faltering gave her a courage she had not known she carried. She lowered her gaze for only a moment before meeting his eyes again, her own steady, though her heart raced. "I knew him," she said softly, "not as the world did, but as a man who once stood in the same place as my mother. He spoke to her with kindness when she had nothing. He did not look at her as though she was invisible." The words pierced Alexander more than he wished to admit. He remembered his father through the lens of wealth and empire, through stories of boardroom triumphs and contracts sealed with a handshake that moved markets. To hear a waitress speak of him in such a human way unsettled him, stirred something deep and unwelcome. He demanded again, sharper now, "Tell me exactly how you knew him. Tell me what you think you know." His voice carried authority, but beneath it there was an edge of urgency, almost desperation. Anna's hands trembled around the tray she still held, yet her voice was quiet and clear. "My mother worked in his mill years ago. He saw her when others did not. When layoffs came and she thought she would lose everything, he made sure she and her family were helped. She never forgot. She told me, if I ever had the chance, to remind his son of the man he once was." Alexander sat back, his mask fractured, his thoughts storming behind eyes that betrayed nothing to the room. He had not expected a stranger to carry pieces of his father's legacy. Yet here she stood, holding them like a mirror he could not look away from. Anna's fingers shook slightly as she slid the tray onto the side stand, her eyes never leaving his. The weight of his stare pressed hard against her chest. Yet she found herself reaching into the pocket of her apron, pulling free a small envelope, worn soft from years of being handled. The edges were frayed, the flap creased again and again, but inside was something she had carried like a talisman since childhood. She hesitated, knowing that once she showed it, there would be no taking it back. Still, she drew out the faded photograph and placed it gently on the table between them, the linen cloth swallowing the sound. Alexander's eyes flicked down, suspicion mingling with curiosity, and the sight froze him. There was his father, Henry Whitmore, younger than Alexander remembered, sleeves rolled up, standing in a factory full of workers. His face was marked by grit and sweat, yet there was a smile that seemed to light the dim industrial room. He was not in a boardroom, not behind polished glass, but among people whose names would never be printed in the news. His arm rested lightly across the shoulders of a man in a grease-stained shirt, his other hand pointing at some half-assembled machine, pride etched into every line of his expression. It was not the polished titan the world remembered, but a man who had once stood in the dust and the noise of honest work. In the corner of the photograph, Alexander saw a young woman, not more than 20, her dark hair tied back, her smile shy but radiant. She stood just behind Henry, almost hidden, as though uncertain whether she belonged in the frame. Anna's hand brushed lightly across the image, her voice quiet but unwavering. "That is my mother," she said. "She never told the story without showing me this picture. She said it was proof that dignity was not just a word, that even men with power could choose to see those who had none." The dining room felt distant, as if its chandeliers and polished marble had faded into the background. Alexander could not pull his eyes away from the photograph. He remembered his father's cufflinks, his father's commanding voice, the awe he inspired in powerful men. Yet here, in this single image, was a side of him Alexander had never truly known. A side he had perhaps tried to bury beneath his own pursuit of perfection. His jaw tightened, his throat constricted, but he forced himself to remain still. Anna withdrew her hand, leaving the photograph where it lay, fragile yet powerful. "Our family's connection to yours was never about wealth," she said softly. "It was about the way your father treated people. My mother never forgot. She told me that if I ever met you, I should remind you of the man he was. Not for money, not for favor, but so you would not lose what he gave you." Alexander sat in silence, his mask shattered further, the photograph before him demanding a reckoning he could not escape. Alexander's fingers brushed the edge of the photograph but did not lift it. His eyes locked on the worn image as though it were a wound that refused to close. The factory walls, the sweat on his father's brow, the young woman in the corner who would later become the mother of the waitress standing before him, all of it pressed against him like a weight he had not prepared for. A ripple of unease twisted through his chest, but he crushed it quickly, drawing on the steel that had carried him through hostile takeovers and boardroom wars. His voice, when it came, was sharp, louder than he intended, slicing through the fragile quiet around the table. "Enough," he said, the word heavy with command. "Stop speaking. You do not get to stand here and use my father's name to manipulate me." Anna flinched at the sudden force of his tone, but did not step back. The photograph remained on the linen, a silent witness, and though her heart raced, she kept her chin lifted. Alexander's fury rolled off him in waves, his polished cufflinks catching the chandelier's glow as his hand clenched into a fist on the table. "I will not be cornered," he continued, his voice low now but edged with fire. "Do you understand me? Whatever stories you think you know, whatever scraps of memory you carry, they do not give you the right to invoke him. He was mine, not yours." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, and something in his eyes betrayed the truth. Doubt flickered there, thin but unmistakable, as if some part of him feared that her story was real, that his father's greatness might have lived as much in the factory as in the empire he left behind. He fought against the thought, clinging to anger as armor, but his gaze returned again and again to the faded photo, unable to escape its quiet accusation. Anna's voice trembled, not from fear but from conviction. "I am not trying to manipulate you," she said softly. "I am only telling you what my mother told me. She said your father was a man who remembered the names of workers when no one else did. She said he gave her dignity when she thought she had none. That is not manipulation. That is truth." Her words struck deeper than he cared to admit, each one chipping at the mask he had tried to pull back over his face. He felt the heat in his chest, the familiar mix of rage and shame that came when someone dared to pierce the polished armor of his authority. Yet beneath it was something else, something he had not felt in years, a gnawing uncertainty that made his voice falter for the briefest second. He forced his glare to remain, forced his jaw to stay hard, but his eyes could not lie. The room held its breath, every guest sensing the battle inside him, the billionaire clinging to fury, even as doubt spread like a crack through stone. Anna stood in silence for a moment, her breath unsteady, yet she knew she could not walk away now. His anger had stung her, his words had pressed her into the kind of humiliation she had endured too often. But the photograph still lay between them, and it demanded that she speak. Her fingers brushed the edge of the picture, tracing the faded outline of her mother's young face, and she lifted her gaze to meet Alexander's eyes. He wanted her to be afraid, to retreat and leave him untouched. But the memory of her mother's voice gave her strength. "My mother worked in your father's mills," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "Not the ones that made headlines, not the polished offices in the city, but the old brick building with broken windows where the air smelled of dye and cotton. She was young then, younger than I am now, working 10 hours a day to help her parents keep food on the table. She told me she had calluses on her hands, so thick they split in the winter, and she came home each night with her back bent from lifting bolts of fabric." Alexander's expression remained hard, yet his eyes narrowed, as though each word carried him closer to something he did not want to face. Anna pressed on, her voice steadying as the story unfolded. Then came the layoffs. The orders had slowed, machines were silent, and rumors filled the air. Men were dismissed, women were told they would not be needed, families lined up outside the office doors, desperate for answers. My mother was terrified. Her father was ill, her younger sister barely old enough to help, and without her wages they would not survive the winter. She thought her life had ended in that moment. She drew a breath, her hand tightening against the tray at her side. "But then your father came, not with bodyguards or lawyers, not with speeches, but with his sleeves rolled up, standing where everyone could see him. He told the workers that he would not let their children starve, that dignity was not something a balance sheet could erase. He made sure the families who were left behind received a stipend until other work could be found. It was not charity," he said. "It was responsibility." The words settled over the table like a quiet storm, and Alexander's jaw shifted, though he did not speak. Anna's eyes softened, and for a moment her exhaustion faded into something brighter. "That kindness saved my mother's family. It meant there was food on the table, medicine when her father's lungs failed him, and school for her sister. Without that, I would not be standing here. My mother told me that story more times than I can count. She said, 'Never forget his name. Never forget what dignity feels like, because men like that are rare.' She wanted me to remind you if I ever could." The dining room seemed to vanish around them, leaving only her story, her trembling yet unbreakable truth, and his silence weighed heavy against it. Anna's voice wavered, but she refused to let it break. Her eyes flicked once toward the photograph still resting on the table, then back to the man who stared at her with the sharpness of someone who had never been spoken to this way in his own house. She swallowed, her throat dry, but the memory of her mother's words pushed her forward. "I am only working here," she said softly, Because my mother asked me to remember. She told me, if you ever see Henry's son, remind him of the good man his father was. The sentence trembled as it left her lips, yet it held steady enough to cut through the silence that had fallen heavy over the room. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his cufflinks flashing as his arms crossed over his chest. The defiance in his posture could not hide the flicker in his eyes, a small betraying shift that revealed how the words had struck him. No one had dared tie his name to his father's in years. People spoke of Henry Whitmore as a legend, a figure cast in bronze, but not as a man who had lifted burdens, who had reached down to remind people they mattered. To hear it now from a waitress with worn shoes made his chest ache with something he did not want to name. Anna's fingers tightened around the tray she held, pressing against the wood until her knuckles whitened. She had feared this moment since she first saw him step into the dining room, feared the weight of his gaze, feared the sharpness of his voice. Yet beneath her fear was something stronger, a courage born not from herself but from her mother's story. She heard her mother's voice as clearly as if she stood beside her, whispering, "Dignity is worth more than money, and truth is worth more than fear." Her breath shook as she spoke again, her words carrying not accusation but plea. "She wanted me to remind you, not because we ever expected anything from you, not because we thought we deserved your wealth, but because she believed your father's spirit should live in you. She said the world would try to make you forget, but if someone told you the story again, maybe it would bring it back." Alexander's eyes narrowed, yet he did not interrupt her. The room around them seemed to vanish, the diners leaning closer in hushed fascination, the waiters frozen mid-step. All that existed was the quiet strength in Anna's trembling voice and the unyielding truth she carried. Her courage held even as her voice quivered on the last words. "I do not care about money or position," she said, steady now despite the tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "I only care that you remember the man your father truly was. That is why I stayed at this job. That is why I stand here now." Her truth settled between them like a stone in still water, rippling out until even Alexander's unbreakable mask could no longer hide the doubt seeping through the cracks. A ripple spread through the dining room, quiet at first, then growing into a current of whispers that moved from table to table. Guests leaned closer to one another, their eyes darting toward the corner where the powerful man sat with a single waitress standing firm before him. Forks were set down without finishing their courses, wine glasses were lowered untouched, and the hushed voices carried the same mix of shock and fascination. Few people had ever seen Alexander Whitmore challenged, and fewer still had seen his composure falter. Tonight, in the glow of chandeliers and the watchful gaze of strangers, the untouchable image he had polished for years began to fracture. The staff, who usually glided across the floor with seamless grace, now stood frozen near the service stations. A busboy clutched a tray to his chest, unsure whether to move, his eyes wide as though he were witnessing a forbidden play. The maître d', always the model of refinement, shifted from one polished shoe to the other, his face pale and unsure whether to intervene. Even the kitchen doors, which usually swung open and shut in a constant rhythm, seemed to pause, as though the entire machinery of the restaurant had stalled. Alexander sat rigid, his jaw tight, the lines of his suit as sharp as ever, yet there was something unmistakably human about the way his hand curled slightly against the linen tablecloth. The room that once bowed to his presence now watched him with the curiosity of spectators waiting for the outcome of a duel. His eyes, which usually gleamed with the cool control of a man used to shaping markets, betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. The whispers swelled again, filled with speculation and awe. Some recognized the name Henry Whitmore, spoken with reverence by the young waitress, and their voices carried fragments of stories they had heard in passing about the founder who had built an empire with both steel and compassion. Anna stood steady, her back straight despite the weight of the stairs around her. She felt the tension thick in the air, but her courage did not waver. Her voice was no longer trembling. Though she did not speak again, she had said enough, and now her silence was its own act of defiance. She let the photograph rest where it was, its faded edges a reminder of the truth she had carried into this room. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the gaze of strangers, not as admiration or envy, but as judgment. He was no longer the figure of control who had walked through the brass doors with polished steps. He was a man cornered by memory and truth, stripped of the armor that wealth and reputation had given him. His polished image, built carefully over decades, began to show cracks in front of people who would carry this story out of the restaurant and into the city by morning. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and profoundly unsettled. Alexander rose from his seat with a suddenness that startled even himself, his chair scraping softly against the polished floor. The whispers surged louder, but he ignored them, his hand cutting the air in a silent command for Anna to follow. Without waiting for permission or protest, he moved with long strides toward a side corridor, the hush of velvet curtains swallowing the gasps and murmurs that trailed behind them. The maitre d' took a nervous step forward as if to interfere, but one hard glance from Alexander kept him rooted where he stood. Anna followed quietly, her heart hammering, yet her steps never faltered. The door shut behind them with a dull click, leaving them in a smaller, dimly lit lounge meant for private meetings and discreet negotiations. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and leather, the shelves lined with bottles of expensive cognac no one ever ordered. Here, the glow of chandeliers was replaced with the softer light of shaded lamps, yet the tension between them burned brighter than any flame. Alexander turned on her sharply, his eyes storm, dark, his voice low but edged like steel. "You will tell me exactly what you know. You will tell me how you knew him, and you will tell me now." Anna stood straight, clutching the tray to steady herself, though she no longer felt the weight of it. She met his gaze with quiet resolve, sensing that in this smaller room he was not the untouchable billionaire, but a man wrestling with the ghosts of his own bloodline. She drew a breath and began. "My mother worked in his factory when she was very young. She said he was not like the owners she had heard of, the ones who stayed in glass offices while others broke their backs below. He came into the mills at night when the machines were loud and the air was thick with dust, and he worked beside them. She said his hands were stained with grease like theirs, that his shirt was soaked with sweat, and he laughed with them while he lifted beams or carried tools." Alexander blinked once, his jaw stiffening, a flicker of disbelief shadowing his face. He had grown up with stories of Henry Whitmore, the builder, the strategist, the man who conquered industries, but never Henry Whitmore, the worker who dirtied his own hands. Anna's voice softened, but carried its own force as she continued. "When wages were late once, she said he came down with his own wallet. He gave money from his pocket to fathers who needed food for their families. He told them no one should wait to feed their children. She said it was not charity, it was responsibility. The same word she always remembered." Alexander turned slightly, his gaze drifting to the shelves as though the shadows there might offer him escape. He had never heard these stories, never been told. His father walked among the workers in the dark hours. The mask of certainty he wore began to crack deeper, though he fought to hold it. Anna's words hung in the quiet room, like threads binding him to a legacy he could no longer deny, each detail reshaping the man he thought he knew. Alexander stood in the quiet lounge, his breath shallow, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of the midnight suit that had once felt like armor. Anna's words hung in the air, refusing to fade, and for the first time in years, he felt stripped of every layer of control. He had built towers of glass that pierced the sky. He had signed contracts that shifted entire markets. He had watched as his name was etched into boardrooms and luxury hotels, yet none of it seemed to matter under the soft light of that room. The photograph on the table, the memory of his father with grease on his hands, and the truth spoken by a waitress who had nothing to gain, all pressed into him until he could no longer deny what he had become. He remembered his father's voice, deep and steady, a sound that carried not just command but warmth. Henry had told him once, when he was a boy, that wealth was not measured in the height of towers, but in the strength of the foundation. Alexander had thought he understood, had believed that building empires was enough. Yet somewhere along the climb he had forgotten the people who made those foundations strong. He had surrounded himself with polished faces and rehearsed compliments, lawyers who told him what he wanted to hear, advisors who bowed at his decisions, and investors who worshipped profit. The real voices, the voices of men and women who carried burdens in silence, had been drowned out long ago. The shame crept slowly at first, then settled like a weight across his chest. He saw the reflection of himself in the polished glass of the cabinet, and it was not the image he wanted to carry. He saw a man defined by numbers, by profit margins, by flawless reports, yet empty where it mattered most. His father had walked factory floors and handed out wages from his own pocket, while Alexander had dined in penthouses and dismissed the tired hands that served him. The gulf between them widened in his mind, until it felt impossible to bridge. Anna stood quietly, watching him, her eyes filled not with triumph, but with something gentler, as though she too understood the pain of seeing truth too clearly. Her silence was louder than any accusation, and Alexander felt the sting of it. He realized that his empire, vast as it was, had been built on forgetting the very people his father had never allowed himself to forget. It was a betrayal, not of the markets or the shareholders, but of blood, of legacy, of dignity. He lowered himself slowly into the chair, his hand pressing against his brow, the photograph still lying before him. The image seemed alive now. Every line of grease on Henry's hands, every tired smile of the workers, every shadowed corner of the factory. He had drifted so far that he could hardly recognize the son his father would have wanted him to be. The weight of shame pressed down on him, heavy and merciless, and for the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore felt profoundly small. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the photograph's quiet testimony, until Anna drew in a breath and forced herself to speak again. Her voice was softer now, not because her courage had faded, but because the truth she carried weighed heavily on her tongue. She glanced toward the door, as though expecting the manager's shadow to appear at any moment, and when she looked back at Alexander, her eyes carried both fear and determination. "There is something else," she said, her fingers tightening around the tray she still held as if it were a shield. "Something I have kept hidden because I was too afraid. But my mother's words are in my head tonight, and I cannot stay silent anymore." Alexander lifted his gaze, his brow furrowed, his eyes dark with the storm already raging inside him. "What is it?" he demanded, though his tone carried less anger now and more urgency. Anna drew a slow breath, her lips trembling before the words found their strength. "The manager here, the one you trust to run this place, has been exploiting the staff. He docks wages for the smallest mistakes. He changes the schedules so people cannot claim their proper hours, and he threatens anyone who questions him. He has turned this restaurant, your father's name, into a cage for people who cannot afford to leave." The words struck like blows, each one tearing at the fragile mask Alexander still clung to. His jaw clenched, his fingers tapping against the arm of the chair as though each tap kept his composure from breaking completely. Anna's voice steadied as she went on. "He cornered me once in his office, said my paycheck would disappear if I did not follow his rules. He told me he could ruin me, that no one would believe a girl like me over a man in a suit. He has done the same to others. Most are too frightened to speak, but I cannot keep this to myself anymore. My mother said dignity matters more than fear, and I think this is what she meant." Alexander leaned forward, his elbows pressing hard into the table, his eyes searching hers for any sign of exaggeration. He found none, only the raw truth in the tremor of her voice and the strength in the way she refused to look away. His mind replayed every polished report, every glowing review that had crossed his desk, and for the first time he realized how easily perfection could be faked when those at the bottom were silenced. Anna swallowed, her courage holding even as her voice softened. I know what I risk saying this to you. He will destroy me if he finds out. But my mother's words keep pushing at me. She told me to remind you of your father, and I believe he would not have let this happen. That is why I am speaking now, even if it costs me everything. The truth hung between them like a ledger of lies, its pages filled with cruelty and silence, and Alexander felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. Alexander did not speak for several moments after Anna's confession, his mind turning like a wheel grinding against stone. He had heard whispers of corruption in other companies, stories of managers who cut corners, but he had always trusted the reports given to him, had trusted the layers of polished figures and perfect reviews. Now he realized how blind he had been, how easy it was for rot to hide beneath marble floors and chandelier light. He reached for his phone with a sudden force, his voice low but sharp, as he gave an order few had ever heard from him. Get me Arthur Pendleton. Arthur had been his COO for more than a decade, a man of quiet precision whose loyalty had never faltered. Within minutes, Arthur arrived at the restaurant, his calm presence a steady counter to the storm brewing inside his employer. He carried no pretense, only a leather folder and the air of a man prepared for anything. Alexander wasted no time. He told him what Anna had revealed, his words clipped and urgent, the photograph still lying between them as silent proof of the legacy they were failing. Arthur listened carefully, his expression hardening with each detail, and then he nodded once, already pulling out his own phone. By the end of the night, discreet investigators were on site, accountants combing through records, security quietly retrieving files. The polished mask of the Gilded Lion began to slip as figures emerged that could not be explained away. Hours disappeared into ledgers and payroll documents, each page revealing the pattern Anna had described. Wages cut without reason, shifts altered to reduce pay, mysterious deductions that had never reached the staff. Alexander stood over the reports as they piled higher, his anger no longer hidden but burning cold and steady. When the manager was finally called into the private room, he arrived with his usual swagger, his suit too tight, his smile oily and practiced. He began to speak of numbers and profits, but the sight of Alexander's stare silenced him. Arthur laid the reports across the table, each sheet a nail in the coffin of his lies. The man's face paled as the truth spread out before him, his excuses faltering, his hands twitching as though searching for an escape. Alexander rose slowly, his voice carrying the weight of judgment that no court could rival. You used my family's name to exploit those who trusted you. You turned this place, which was meant to honor my father's legacy, into your own kingdom of theft. You humiliated the people who keep these doors open. That ends tonight. The manager stammered, tried to deny, but Arthur's steady voice cut through with facts that could not be ignored. Within minutes, security escorted the man from the building, his protests drowned by the silence of staff who watched with wide eyes. For the first time in years, they saw accountability, and though fear lingered, hope stirred quietly beneath it. Alexander looked at Anna then, the photograph still between them, and he knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The following evening, the dining room of the Gilded Lion carried a different weight, not the hushed awe of polished wealth, but a quiet anticipation that rippled through every table. The chandeliers burned as bright as ever, the velvet curtains framed the windows in gold, yet the air was less heavy, as if something long hidden had been pulled into the light. Staff who had once walked with stiff shoulders and guarded eyes now stood a little taller, their gazes flicking to the corner where Alexander Whitmore prepared to speak. He was not seated this time, not shrouded in the untouchable aura of his fortune, but standing before them as a man who had something to set right. Arthur Pendleton stood at his side, a folder in hand, but he did not speak. This moment was not his to command. Alexander cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet, and lifted his gaze across the room. The waiters, the busboys, the hostesses, even the chefs who had slipped out from the kitchen, all stood waiting, their faces marked with caution, some with disbelief, others with the faintest spark of hope. "For too long," Alexander began, his voice steady but stripped of arrogance, "this place has been run on fear. That ends now." His words carried across the marble floors, reaching even the corners of the dining room. He lifted a sheet of paper from Arthur's folder, though he barely glanced at it. "Every wage that was stolen will be restored. Every hour docked will be paid in full. The debts that were fabricated against you are erased, permanently, with no conditions." A murmur moved through the staff, low and unsure at first, then stronger as the words took root. Alexander continued, his eyes scanning their faces, noting the disbelief in some, the tears beginning in others. "You will not be threatened here again. New protections are being put in place. There will be direct lines of oversight, and anyone who abuses their authority will answer to me personally. This restaurant will not be a cage, it will be a place of pride, as it was meant to be when my father's name first hung above the door." The room shifted then, something intangible but powerful. The staff who had been silenced for so long, who had carried their fear like chains, began to breathe differently. Shoulders relaxed, eyes brightened, and for the first time in years, there was the faint hum of dignity where fear had once reigned. A young busboy, no older than 16, clutched a tray against his chest, his lips parting as if to thank him, though no words came. An older waitress wiped at her eyes with the edge of her apron, shaking her head as though she could not quite believe what she had heard. Alexander felt the weight of their gazes, not as judgment this time but as something more binding, responsibility. He knew restitution was only the beginning, but as he watched the fear fade from the faces around him, he felt the first fragile step toward honoring the legacy his father had left behind. The following morning, the restaurant staff gathered once more, summoned not by fear of discipline, but by curiosity and a sense that something had shifted forever. Alexander Whitmore stood at the front of the dining room, sunlight streaming through the tall windows behind him, his posture still carrying the quiet authority of a man who commanded billions, yet his voice softened in a way few had ever heard. He spoke not of profit or expansion, but of legacy, and the word lingered in the air as though it had found new meaning. His gaze swept across the room, pausing on faces that had long hidden behind lowered eyes, and then settled on Anna, who stood near the back with her hands folded tightly together. He took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, and his words rang clear. "Last night I saw something I cannot ignore. I saw a young woman stand against humiliation and fear, not for herself, but for what is right. She carried the memory of my father into this room and held it before me when I had forgotten it. She reminded me that this company, this name, was never meant to be a symbol of fear. It was meant to be a promise of dignity." A hush fell deeper still, and all eyes turned to Anna. Her cheeks flushed, her heart raced, and she wished for a moment she could vanish. Yet she held her ground. Alexander's voice carried on, steady and resolute. "From this day forward, Anna Vance will no longer serve at these tables. She will not carry trays or endure insults in silence. She will serve in a higher way. I am appointing her as Director of Cultural Integrity and Employee Welfare for Whitmore Holdings." Gasps rose from the staff, disbelief mingling with awe. Anna's breath caught, her lips parting, but no words came. Alexander's gaze never left hers as he continued. "Her role will be simple, yet vital. She will ensure that no worker is humiliated, discarded, or silenced as she nearly was. She will carry forward the principle my father lived by, that responsibility runs deeper than profit. She will answer directly to me, and I expect every manager, every executive, every hand in this company to honor her voice. Remember, The words settled into the marble walls and velvet curtains, sinking into the very bones of the place. Anna felt her knees weaken, her fingers trembling as though she could not contain the weight of what had just been laid upon her. Yet beneath the fear was something brighter, something fierce, the echo of her mother's lessons, the echo of Henry Whitmore's kindness. For the first time she believed her story mattered, that her courage had not been wasted. The staff began to clap, hesitant at first, then stronger, the sound rising through the dining room like a tide breaking free. Alexander did not smile, but his eyes softened as he watched Anna stand taller than she ever had before. A new legacy had been born, not of towers or fortunes, but of dignity restored. Weeks later, the Gilded Lion glowed with the same chandeliers, the same polished marble, the same velvet curtains. Yet the air inside was not the same. The fear that had once clung to the staff had lifted, replaced by a quiet dignity that moved in every step they took. Wages had been restored, debts erased, protections set firmly in place, and in every corner of the dining room, a sense of fairness had begun to grow. At the prime corner table, the very table where humiliation had once cracked the air, Alexander Whitmore now sat, not as a man waiting to be served, but as someone who had come to remember. Across from him sat Anna, no longer in uniform, her hair loose over her shoulders, a notebook resting beside her plate with plans for the new foundation she had been asked to lead. Between them lay the photograph, its edges still frayed, the factory walls still etched in faded ink, Henry Whitmore's smile still alive in the image. Alexander reached for the picture, his fingertips brushing against its worn surface, and he let the silence stretch between them, not uncomfortable now, but full of meaning. Around them the staff moved gracefully, no longer avoiding his gaze but meeting it with respect that came not from fear, but from gratitude. Diners still turned their heads, still whispered at the sight of the billionaire, seated with a young woman who had once carried trays with trembling hands, but the whispers were softer, touched with wonder rather than gossip. Anna folded her hands on the table, her eyes steady, her posture calmer than it had been on that first night. She had grown into her role quickly, carrying her mother's wisdom into boardrooms and meetings where her voice was now heard. She had already begun drafting policies to ensure fairness across every branch of Whitmore Holdings, and though the work was heavy, she carried it with pride. She glanced at Alexander, still struck at times by the fact that the man who had dismissed her so sharply was now her ally, her partner in building something larger than both of them. The meal before them sat untouched for a moment, both of them lost in the weight of what had been changed. Finally, Alexander reached across the table, his large hand closing gently over hers. His voice dropped to a whisper that carried not the authority of a CEO, but the tenderness of a son. "My father would have been proud." Anna felt her throat tighten, her eyes glistening as she looked down at their clasped hands. Then, at the photograph that had begun it all. She smiled softly, not with triumph, but with quiet peace, and the room around them seemed to fade, until only the three of them remained, Alexander, Anna, and the memory of Henry Whitmore, binding them together across time. In that final image, wealth and power were no longer the story. Dignity was. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.